I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Princess Anne had expected resistance. She had not expected humiliation. Behind closed palace doors, a council she believed would support her instead delivered a decision that stripped her order of authority and restored Prince Edward's access to sensitive crown channels. Anne remained silent as the ruling was read aloud. Then came the sentence that changed the mood completely. Her instruction had not merely been questioned, it had been formally overturned. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had issued the protective order for one reason: something inside the royal system no longer felt secure. She had temporarily restricted Edward's crown access after questions emerged over who could enter confidential briefings and who had been receiving succession-related papers. Crown access meant permission to attend restricted royal meetings, receive protected constitutional material, and take part in sensitive discussions tied to the sovereign's official duties. The Palace Council, a dramatized internal body reviewing sensitive royal procedures and authority, now declared that she had gone beyond the power given to her. Her order was cancelled. Edward's access was restored in full. The decision landed harder than Anne allowed anyone to see. As the council secretary finished reading the signed ruling, she kept her face controlled and her back straight. Yet her fingers tightened around the closed folder in front of her. The secretary pushed the decision across the table. She looked down once, shut her own papers, and refused to touch it. Across the room, Edward felt something equally complicated. Relief should have come first. Instead, shame followed it. He had regained his position, but the price was watching his sister's judgment publicly weakened inside the very institution both of them had spent decades serving. Something else troubled Anne even more. The ruling sounded too polished. Its wording anticipated arguments she had not yet been allowed to make, and according to a documented internal account prepared after the meeting, portions of the council language had been circulated before she entered the room. That changed everything. This was no sudden disagreement. Someone had prepared for her defeat. One council member barely met her eyes as the secretary collected the remaining papers, and she immediately understood what that silence could mean. Conversations had happened before the official conversation began. Anne rose without protesting. That restraint unsettled Edward more than anger would have. He watched her prepare to leave and knew the decision had not ended the matter. She paused at the door, turned back toward the council, and asked only one question: who had requested the emergency review of her order? No answer came quickly enough. Anne could survive losing a vote. She could even survive humiliation. But if someone close to the family had engineered the decision before she ever entered that room, then the next confrontation would no longer be about procedure. It would be about loyalty, and Edward was about to discover why his sister had acted against him in the first place. Edward did not celebrate. That was what unsettled Anne most. His access had been restored, his position protected, and the council had effectively declared that her attempt to shield the crown had gone too far. Yet when brother and sister finally faced each other, there was no triumph in his voice, only disappointment. The decision had created something neither of them wanted, a victory for Edward that felt like a betrayal of Anne. Edward waited until the aides were gone before speaking. Crown access, the restricted permission allowing senior royals to enter sensitive meetings, receive protected constitutional briefings, and take part in confidential discussions tied to the sovereign, had been returned to him, but he no longer looked relieved. He had spent years building his standing through quiet duty, consistency, and obedience to the institution. Anne knew that. She also knew why the restriction had cut so deeply. It did not simply limit his privileges. It suggested that someone inside the family had questioned whether his judgment could be trusted. Edward looked directly at his sister. "You should have come to me first." The words were calm, but the hurt beneath them was unmistakable. He told Anne that learning about the restriction through officials made him feel less like a brother and more like a security concern that needed to be contained. She absorbed the accusation without interrupting. Then, after a long silence, she finally answered, "I was afraid you would make me change my mind." That admission hurt them both. Anne believed sensitive royal privileges mattered only when they protected the crown, not when they protected pride. But she also knew that speaking to Edward first might have forced her to choose between family affection and the decision she believed duty demanded. Then Edward changed the conversation completely. In a private account of their meeting, later preserved among palace notes, he admitted that someone had warned him several hours before Anne's order was issued that his access could soon be challenged. She stared at him. The humiliation of the council ruling suddenly felt secondary. If he had been warned beforehand, then someone knew her move was coming. Anne pressed him for the name. Edward refused. He said, exposing that person immediately would turn an already painful family dispute into something far more destructive. She did not argue at first, but her silence hardened. Whoever gave that warning had known enough about her intentions to act before the order existed. That meant the conflict surrounding his access had begun long before the council meeting. Edward finally offered one detail. The warning came after a private Windsor meeting attended by someone Anne trusted. That was enough. Anne understood that the argument between brother and sister was only the surface. The real fracture had begun earlier, inside a room everyone had since tried to forget. And what happened there would explain why she had moved against Edward in the first place. Weeks before the council overturned Anne, a much quieter confrontation had already set the disaster in motion. It happened after a Windsor briefing that should have ended routinely. Instead, one question from Edward caused Anne to stop gathering her papers. Another answer made her expression harden. By the time the room emptied, she had reached a conclusion that would later cost her dearly. Edward's access had become too broad, and someone inside the palace was taking advantage of it. Charles had gradually widened Edward's briefing access because the king was relying more heavily on senior working members of the family to carry ceremonial and institutional pressure. Anne had supported that arrangement from the beginning. It reduced strain on the sovereign, gave the monarchy greater continuity, and allowed trusted relatives to absorb sensitive responsibilities when schedules became demanding. But the succession contingency memorandum changed everything. That document was a confidential plan outlining how royal duties and authority would be managed if the sovereign became temporarily unable to act. Anne believed it had been circulated only to Charles, William, herself, and a small group of constitutional advisors. Edward mentioned the memorandum almost casually. Anne stopped writing. "Who gave that to you?" He looked genuinely confused by the question. The paper, he explained, had appeared in his briefing packet alongside other approved material, and he had assumed his access covered it. She pressed him harder. Had he asked why something so sensitive had suddenly been placed before him? His expression changed at once. Edward heard suspicion, where Anne believed she was asking a security question. He reminded her that he had spent years accepting whatever duties the crown placed in front of him without demanding special treatment. She knew that was true, which made the moment even more painful. Anne did not accuse her brother of taking anything deliberately. She feared something worse. After the Windsor meeting ended, she checked the official distribution record and found no authorization adding Edward to the memorandum list. His name simply did not belong there. Hours later, a palace clerk confirmed in a documented internal account that an access instruction had been inserted manually after the briefing package had already received approval. Someone had changed the route of a protected document without leaving the normal chain of authorization intact. Anne read the distribution sheet alone and circled Edward's name twice. Not because she believed he had betrayed anyone, because somebody may have been using his trusted position as an opening. That distinction mattered. If she was right, then the danger was not Edward. The danger was the person who understood the system well enough to place confidential material in front of him and make it look routine. That discovery pushed Anne toward the protective order. She believed freezing his access temporarily would close the gap long enough to identify who had altered the packet. What she did not know was that the person behind the irregular access had already realized she was looking. The protective order was meant to close a dangerous door. Instead, it forced whoever had opened that door to prepare for a fight. Anne did not demand another council meeting. She demanded a conversation. The distinction mattered. Away from the formal table, there would be no prepared statements and no procedural language to hide behind. She confronted the senior council figure, who had initiated the emergency review of her order, and asked one direct question. Why had protecting restricted crown material suddenly been treated as an attack on Edward? Anne closed the door herself before either of them sat down. She removed the council ruling from her folder and placed it between them. The official began carefully, arguing that her restriction had affected the constitutional working capacity of a senior royal and therefore required wider authorization. Constitutional working capacity meant the formal ability of a royal figure to carry out duties connected to the sovereign and receive information necessary for those responsibilities. Anne listened without interruption. Then she reminded him that her instruction had never been intended as punishment. It was temporary. Its purpose was to freeze questionable access until officials discovered how confidential material had entered Edward's briefing packet without a proper authorization trail. The official pushed back harder. He told Anne that suspicion had begun to outrun evidence. The accusation struck exactly where it hurt. Discipline had defined her public life. She did not act on impulse, and she knew he understood that. Her answer came quickly. The council had restored Edward before identifying who altered the distribution process. To her, that was not caution. It was a decision to reopen the same door before anyone understood who had unlocked it. Anne leaned forward and asked the question she had carried from the moment the ruling was read. Had the outcome been agreed upon before she was even invited to defend her order? The official hesitated. According to a documented internal account of their private exchange, he admitted that consultations had taken place before the formal review. He defended them as necessary discussions designed to prevent a constitutional dispute from spreading through the working royal family. Anne heard the explanation, but she also heard the admission underneath it. The machinery had started moving before she entered the room. The official finally revealed what senior figures truly feared. Edward had never been the central issue. Anne's order had created a precedent. If it stood, one senior royal could potentially restrict another's access without direct approval from the sovereign or an established review process. The council had not simply defended Edward. It had defended its own authority and the structure surrounding the crown. Then Anne noticed the second signature on the review request. The official began gathering his papers. She placed one finger firmly on the ruling. "You have not answered who asked you to begin this." He stopped. That silence told Anne more than another prepared statement ever could. The council had protected its power, but someone much closer to her had helped open the challenge. And when she learned whose name sat behind that second signature, the wound would no longer feel institutional. It would feel personal. Anne had spent decades becoming indispensable without ever pretending to be sovereign. That balance had protected her, until now. The council's ruling exposed the invisible boundary she had crossed. She could advise, warn, intervene, and protect. But she could not permanently control another senior royal's crown privileges without authority flowing from the monarch. And when Charles finally opened the confidential review file, Anne discovered he had known the challenge was coming. Charles read her order alone, then turned to the council reversal. He placed the two documents apart, instead of stacking them together. That small separation said more than any speech. The monarch held ultimate authority over internal royal access connected to constitutional and official duties, while palace councils could review how protected material was handled. Anne's influence came from decades of trust, discipline, and service. But influence was not command. The council had used that difference against her, and Charles knew exactly why it mattered. Charles understood her fear. He accepted that a confidential succession document had reached Edward through an unexplained route. But he also believed Anne had created a dangerous precedent by restricting her brother without first bringing the matter directly to him. If one senior royal could suspend another's privileges alone, then every future dispute could become a battle of personal authority. Anne heard the argument, but it did not soften what came next. Anne asked him when he first learned an emergency review was being discussed. His silence answered before his words did. She felt abandoned. Charles had known the council might challenge her order, and had said nothing. In a private recorded conversation, preserved for this dramatized account, he admitted he had not initiated the reversal. He had allowed the review to proceed because he wanted to know whether her decision could survive formal scrutiny. To Anne, that explanation felt colder than opposition. He had watched the test happen. Without warning her, she was already standing inside it. Charles pushed the confidential review file toward her. She did not open it. He kept his voice low. William believed this could not be allowed to become permanent. That name changed everything. William had supported the second request for review because he feared Anne's order could fracture the working royal family and establish a rule future generations might abuse. Charles explained that the prince had challenged the method, not the security concern itself. But Anne barely heard the distinction. She had expected resistance from advisors. She had prepared for disagreement from officials. She had not prepared herself to learn that someone she trusted inside the family had helped place her authority under examination. Anne finally looked at the file, but still refused to touch it. The council had overturned her order. Charles had permitted the challenge. And now William stood somewhere inside the decision that had humiliated her. The defeat was no longer institutional. It had become personal. William did not deny it. That almost made the truth harder for Anne to accept. He had supported a review of her order because he believed the monarchy could not survive senior royals quietly stripping one another of institutional privileges. To him, the danger was precedent. To Anne, the danger was the document that reached Edward without authorization. Both believed they were protecting the crown. Now each believed the other had protected it incorrectly. William approached the crisis as a future sovereign, which meant every decision looked larger than the people making it. The rules established now could shape how the royal household operated under his eventual reign. Anne saw the same crisis through decades of disciplined service, where stopping a breach could matter more than protecting feelings. That difference finally stood between them. When he confirmed he had supported the review, she removed her glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them down. "You could have spoken to me before turning my decision into a council test." William did not retreat. In a private recorded conversation preserved for this dramatized account, he admitted that he feared speaking to Anne first would reduce the issue to an argument between relatives. He wanted the question examined as institutional authority. Could one senior royal restrict another without approval from the sovereign or an independent process? Anne listened, then delivered the sentence he had not expected. Avoiding the family conversation, she told him, had created a far worse family conflict. The council had not merely questioned her method, it had humiliated her in front of people who already knew the outcome was moving against her. William's expression changed. "I challenged your authority, not your concern," Anne answered immediately. The council did not understand the difference. That distinction opened something neither of them had noticed before. William revealed that he had never supported permanently restoring unrestricted access to Edward without further examination. His expectation was simple: cancel Anne's unilateral order, then replace it immediately with a neutral security review. A neutral security review meant an independent check of how confidential material had moved through palace systems without allowing the family dispute itself to determine the result. William then admitted something more disturbing. That second step had never happened. Edward's full access had been restored before anyone had identified who inserted the confidential memorandum into his briefing packet. Anne stared at him. For days, she had believed William helped defeat her because he trusted the system more than her judgment. Now he was telling her the system had not followed the path he believed he was authorizing. The anger between them shifted. William began reconstructing the timeline. Anne did the same. Her order had been overturned quickly. His expected security review had disappeared. Edward had been restored completely, and the original access irregularity remained unexplained. For the first time since the humiliation began, Anne saw something more disturbing than betrayal. She and William had been fighting each other, while someone else benefited from the confusion. And if that was true, then the next person Anne needed to face was not William at all. It was Edward. No council member entered the room. No secretary took notes. No briefing folders separated them. Anne and Edward finally spoke simply as brother and sister, and the conversation changed the shape of the entire conflict. Edward admitted that restored crown access no longer felt like a victory. Anne admitted something equally difficult. She had never believed he deliberately sought material he was not meant to receive. Her order had been aimed at the system, but it had wounded him instead. Edward spoke first. His privileges had technically been restored, but nothing about the situation felt normal anymore. Crown access, the permission to receive restricted royal information and enter sensitive official discussions, now carried the shadow of the disputed Windsor packet. Anne understood why. The crisis had exploded because royal privilege and family trust had been treated as though they were the same thing. He had taken her restriction personally. Only thing. She had treated it as a security measure. Both had paid for that difference. Edward finally told his sister what he wished she had done from the beginning. If she had shown him the irregular distribution record and explained why she was worried, he would have stepped away from restricted briefings voluntarily. Anne believed him. That made her own admission harder. She had acted without warning because she feared whoever altered the system might erase evidence if they knew questions were being asked. She had chosen speed over trust. He understood the logic, but he told her quietly that logic could not erase the moment he learned his own sister had signed the restriction before speaking to him. Then Edward reached into his papers and produced something Anne had not seen before. It was the original warning note he had kept. In a documented private account of their conversation, he identified the person who had alerted him before the order. A senior administrative aide with unusual visibility across several royal briefing schedules. The name struck Anne immediately. That same aide had handled the late amendment that placed Edward on the confidential Windsor distribution list. The pieces finally connected. Edward had not asked for the memorandum. Anne had not imagined the breach. And the warning given before her order had come from someone directly linked to the original access change. What had looked like a battle between brother and sister now pointed back toward one palace figure who had been able to see both sides of the system. Anne read the warning note again before handing it back. "We should have been standing on the same side from the beginning." Edward did not argue. That moment changed everything. Their trust was not fully repaired, but the conflict between them had finally stopped feeding the real problem. Together, they agreed to take the evidence directly to Charles. This time there would be no competing orders, no council maneuvering, and no divided family message. Their reconciliation could not erase the humiliation, but it gave the palace something it had lacked from the first moment: the truth, carried into the next confrontation by both siblings together. By morning, the palace could no longer contain the damage. The story had escaped the council chamber and become a public argument about royal power, sibling loyalty, and whether Anne had been punished for acting too aggressively or for spotting a genuine weakness first. Yet one image dominated everything: Anne arriving for an engagement hours after the humiliation, expression controlled, schedule unchanged, refusing to behave like a royal figure defeated. Anne's silence only intensified the debate. One side saw a senior royal who had crossed a line by restricting another family member's privileges without enough authority. The other saw someone who had identified a serious weakness and been punished before the weakness itself was properly examined. Crown privileges, the protected access senior royals received to certain official meetings, papers, and duties, suddenly became part of a much larger public argument about who had the right to control them. Edward now stood at the center of that storm as well, because his restored access had become symbolic of the fight itself. The pressure exploded when a fictional London newspaper published the headline, "Anne Overruled," above an image of her continuing an official engagement only hours after the council decision. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered as broadcasters described the dispute as one of the sharpest internal challenges to her authority in years. Edward watched the headline appear during a television discussion and felt his stomach tighten. He now understood that Anne had not invented the problem. She had identified a real weakness. Seeing her portrayed simply as defeated no longer felt fair. William felt the same discomfort, for a different reason. He watched the coverage reduce everything to a family power struggle, and realized his intervention had helped create exactly the spectacle he had wanted to prevent. He had backed a review to protect the structure of royal authority. Instead, the story now looked like a future king helping overrule his aunt, while Edward benefited from the result. The nuance had vanished. The damage had not. Then the palace released something far more important: a revised security review. An internal examination of how restricted material had moved through the royal system confirmed that Edward had never requested the unauthorized memorandum. The distribution process itself had been improperly altered. That finding changed the emotional balance instantly. Edward was cleared of deliberate wrongdoing. Anne's central fear was validated. The administrative aid linked to the late amendment was removed from sensitive briefing duties, while the palace tightened access controls. Her original method remained officially rejected, but the reason she acted could no longer be dismissed as suspicion without substance. Edward switched off the television and immediately requested a meeting with Charles. William knew why. The council had already ruled on Anne's authority. Now the king had to decide what the family would remember. Would she leave this crisis as the royal who overstepped, or as the person who saw the danger before anyone else was willing to admit it? The council had delivered its verdict. Now Charles had to deliver the one that mattered inside the family. Charles did not restore Anne's order. That mattered. He also refused to let the humiliation become the final judgment on her actions. In the meeting that closed the crisis, the king drew a careful line between authority and instinct. Anne had exceeded the limits of what she could impose alone, but she had been correct that the crown's briefing system had been compromised. She had lost the procedural battle. She had not imagined the danger. Charles made the new rules clear. Any future restriction on a senior royal's crown access would require direct sovereign authorization or an established security review before it could take effect. Crown access meant permission to receive restricted royal information, enter sensitive meetings, and handle protected briefing material tied to official duties. He also ordered a new distribution control system so no confidential document could be added to a briefing packet without a recorded authorization trail. The change mattered because the crisis had exposed two dangers at once: one person acting beyond their authority, and another quietly altering a system that everyone had assumed was secure. Charles then turned to Anne. In a private recorded conversation preserved for this dramatized account, he told her he would not reverse the council ruling simply to repair her pride. But he also refused to let the palace remember her warning as baseless. She had crossed a procedural line, he said. Yet she had crossed it because she had noticed something real. Edward spoke next. He told the family that Anne had been right to question how the confidential memorandum reached him. His restored access had never felt like a victory over his sister, and he made that point unmistakably clear. William followed with an apology of his own. He admitted that supporting the review without warning her had deepened the humiliation. Anne accepted it. But she also acknowledged that her decision had forced the future king to confront a dangerous precedent he could not simply ignore. Then came the final finding. The completed inquiry concluded that the senior administrative aide had altered Edward's briefing distribution without proper authority, attempting to widen information sharing informally before concealing the breach when questions began. The aide permanently lost access to protected Crown briefing systems. Edward kept his privileges, but only under the newly tightened controls. Charles closed the inquiry file. Edward moved first. Instead of remaining opposite Anne, he quietly took the seat beside her. William stayed nearby. Nobody celebrated. Anne finally understood what the crisis had cost and what it had saved. She had been wrong about how far her authority extended. She had been right that the system was vulnerable. Edward understood why she acted. She understood why protecting the crown could never mean placing herself above the rules designed to protect it. Anne entered the crisis believing duty meant holding the line alone. She left knowing something harder. Duty without trust can divide a family, while trust without rules can endanger a crown. Her order was overturned. Her authority was challenged. But her warning was proven real, and that truth repaired what humiliation nearly destroyed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.